Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi, Geshe. Good to see you all. Hope all are well and safe in those times, wherever you are in the world. So thank you all for joining. Thank you all for coming here. Thank you, Geshe, for the teachings. I want to remind everyone that this activity of Dharma Friends of Israel is done voluntary, and you can support it in future activity and future teachings by contribution using the PayPal link in the chat. Also, of course, to support the teacher. And also to mention that there is a new email for questions. And some people ask me what is the email, because I think most of the people see in the YouTube channel and not on the Zoom class, so I will also read it. It's dalit.dfi@gmail.com. Dalit is dalit.dfi@gmail.com. Okay, so this is the email for questions to Geshe. So you're welcome to use it for future questions. And thank you very much, Geshe. This is, by the way, I will just say, the last time I'm hosting the class, so it was a pleasure. Thank you all for for allowing this.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Shir. Well, we're sorry you're leaving, but it's great you're going for a retreat. So, yeah, I'm really rejoicing in you doing that. Okay, now let's start, as we usually start, with a short meditation. First, some breathing meditation, and then I'll guide you through setting your motivation. Now first visualize in the space in front of you, visualize the Buddha. Who's of one nature with your Lama. And the Buddha is surrounded by all great masters of the different traditions. The Nalanda masters, the Tibetan masters, all the great realized beings are right in front of you. As an inspiration and an object of refuge. And again, they're inseparable from your personal Lama or personal Lamas. And then think that you're surrounded by all sentient beings of this world. And any other world. Experiencing endless sufferings, great anxiety and worry, pain, hatred, and other unwanted emotions. All having the potential to remove these unwanted states of mind, but not yet able to transform their mind and to apply the means for removing all their suffering. To remember that they're just like ourselves, wanting peace of mind, and avoiding suffering. Therefore, generate affectionate love, which is the type of mind that feels close towards any sentient being. Considering every sentient being as lovable, as endearing. Out of an acceptance of who they are, with all their faults and afflictions. And that affectionate love then gives way to great compassion. An affectionate mind that wishes for all sentient beings to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. which then turns into affection that wishes for myself to be able to free all sentient beings from suffering and its causes. So thinking, may I lead all sentient beings away from suffering and its causes. And then that mental factor of great compassion gives rise to a special altruistic attitude, which is the determination, I will do whatever I can, and no matter how long it takes, to help sentient beings to free themselves from suffering and its causes. Which then, based on the understanding that the best state to fulfill this determination is to become a Buddha ourselves. Therefore, we generate the mind of enlightenment, the aspiration, more so the determination to become enlightened for the welfare of all sentient beings. And it is with this motivation that we also study Chattakirti's text. And then recite the prayers together. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from happiness that is free from suffering. And may all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. And then directed at the front visualization of the Buddha and the great masters. Reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time. And rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence. And turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own and the merits of others to the great enlightenment. Okay. Great. All right. Well, for this coming week, again, as His Holiness advises, the center of our attention should be the mind of enlightenment. So when things become tough, especially when afflictive emotions arise, such as hatred, anger, aversion, attachment, and so forth, just remind yourself, I'm doing this for the sake of all sentient beings. Kind of bring it back to that kind of mind. Not letting go of it, just continuing to do it several times a day if you can remember. Even if you've got gaps in between sometimes, well, still keep doing it. Don't give up on it. But on top of that, of course, for this coming week, we've been talking already about afflictive emotions, how they arise, how they work, how they function. And of course, we all know about their destructive effects. Now, last time I spoke about the way they arise in the sense that thus there's an exaggerated sense, well, in the case of anger or aversion, for instance, an exaggerated sense of the negativity of my object of anger. And then that gives rise to an emotional response, which is described as anger. And so the question that may arise, well, if we say anger is a state of mind that exaggerates the negativity of its object and has an emotional response to that object by wanting to be separated from the object, possibly wanting to harm the object, and so forth. Attachment, of course, does the opposite. It focuses on only the positive aspects of that past, exaggerating those, and doesn't want to let go, holds on to this particular object. Now, the question that arises, and I guess it's easy to answer that one, since we already spoke about it, what comes first? The extreme emotional response or the exaggerated perception of the object? And as we've had, it's the exaggerated perception of the object, perceiving the object of, like perceiving it to be 100% negative, undesirable, unpleasant, and what have you in the case of aversion. And of course, completely wonderful, perfect, and whatsoever in the case of attachment. Of course, we need to see it. There's different variations here. The strength of that misperception that differs, but in general, attachment works like that, anger works like that. So the exaggeration comes first. So there's an incorrect view that precedes, and I'm not even talking about our misapprehension of reality, that all perceiving all things to exist independently and so forth. Even just leaving that aside, our emotional response, that is anger, attachment, it's an emotional response to an exaggerated perception of the world. And we should therefore learn to become aware of how we go from A to Z. In other words, how we get from that exaggerated sense of how that person's negative and so forth, and then to this emotional response. And it's interesting how these emotional responses, as I call them, or these afflictive emotions, they also have a counterpart that is not exaggerated. So in everyday life, of course, someone does something that we consider to be negative, and there's the thought, oh, that's not okay. This shouldn't happen. So this kind of disapproval, if you like, that does not come along with this exaggeration and the feeling of aversion, but just disapproving of something. So that's all right. But it's a balanced type of mind. Yes, the person made a mistake. That's not okay. Possibly telling that person, reacting in such a way that we may speak up, but without the sense of anger and hatred and so forth. And of course, in the case of attachment, this exaggerated holding on, well, what is a type of mind that is the non-exaggerated version of that? Well, liking someone, feeling love, having the wish for that person to be happy. And that comes along with an acceptance of positive and negative sides, whereas the attachment just totally exaggerates the positive sides. And instead of wishing for this object to be happy, in the case of a person wanting that person to be happy, we expect that person to make us happy. So in a sense, we have the basis for these exaggerated states of mind. Well, we have these minds already now. At times, mind is just disapproving of something or has love towards other sentient beings. But the problem arises when we exaggerate, when something negative that we find unpleasant, there's this feeling of unpleasantness, they do something and we find that unpleasant, and then that gives rise to exaggerating that unpleasantness. The whole person becomes unpleasant and anger sets in. And it's only from the perspective of that anger, it's only from that perspective that this person seems to be totally negative. Like the next moment when the anger is gone, that goes away. But like I said, it's important, as I said last week, it's so important to become aware, to get to know your afflictive emotions better. And then, of course, if we can apply emptiness and so forth and allow for these minds to disappear just because we reflect on emptiness, well, that's great. But, well, if we can't do that, at least to be really aware, to be mindful of what's going on. What's the situation? What am I thinking? How am I responding to what the other person does? And actually catch it in the act. Like when the exaggerating mind sets in, okay, wait a minute. Oh, this is happening, right? So to focus again for this coming week, of course, combined with the wish to become enlightened for the welfare of sentient beings, working continuously on that kind of state of mind. And of course, it's preceding love, compassion, as we've done through the meditation, but to also focus on the afflictive emotions, how they function, how they manifest and so forth, and to catch them in the act, or to do something against them, to do something about them, apply the antidote. For instance, jealousy arises. Like I said last time, jealousy or envy, depending. They're actually two different things. Often when Dharma teachings are given, the word jealousy really means envy. There's a different word in Tibetan for envy and jealousy. So here, envy, well, jealousy, of course, in terms of being jealous if our partner possibly talks to someone else, that type of jealousy, and envy in the sense of competitiveness, of having aversion, feeling aversion towards someone who possesses something, who's achieved something, and so forth, that we actually have, that we want to achieve, that we want to possess, that we are attached to, in other words. So a mixture of those two. And again, understanding it's aversion for that person, because they don't deserve to get what I really want. So there's attachment toward that particular object, and there's aversion towards that person, to become aware of that. And then, of course, to apply the antidote, such as rejoicing. This person deserves whatever they've achieved in the same way as I feel I deserve it. How are we so different? And if I can rejoice when I get it, I can also learn to rejoice in the other person. And it doesn't take away anything from me. In fact, it gives me more joy. It's almost like I've achieved it myself, because now I'm joyful in the same way as if I achieved it. So really, we like to achieve things because we think they make us happy. And if I can rejoice in the achievement of the other person, I've got that happiness, and I don't have to work as hard. No, I'm kidding. But the point is, so to practice rejoicing. It's part of the practice we already do at the beginning of class, when you rejoice in the virtuous actions of holy and ordinary beings. Well, in the sense, not just of virtuous actions, but of anything good that happens to other people. All right. So having said all this, of course, what I talk about this week, I already spoke about this last week. I said, well, we talk about how we know this week. And that relates closely to mindfulness. Well, closely in an indirect way. We speak about it. We don't speak of mindfulness as such, but it explains the mechanism of mindfulness, how it works, especially mindfulness of our own mind. So how does that actually take place? When I say for this week, what's your own afflictive emotions, how they arise and so forth? Well, that refers to mindfulness of our own mind, of our own emotions and so forth. Now, unfortunately, Chandrakirti doesn't present it in a really easy kind of way, because the subject matter is not easy at all. One thing, I'm very, very busy right now with some translation work for the upcoming teaching. So I just hardly have any time to sit down with all the questions you have. So I'll try and get back to all your questions. Some of you asked questions. Eduardo, last time I remember I mentioned that he asked a question and I never answered it. So I'll address that. And of course, Jim had a question. I want to address that as well. So please bear with me. If the question is no longer needs to be answered, then please maybe send an email to the address that was given, or just write it once again. Write your question again. Maybe it's changed a little bit anyway, so maybe you could reformulate your question, and I will definitely make a point addressing it next Sunday. Okay, now what are we talking about? So without answering any questions this time, I want to talk about this particular topic here now. Now, if we can go to the text, it's still part of the mind-only school, but as it is the nature of this text, actually it's in the context of refuting the mind-only school, but of course it goes further than that. It addresses other ideas that are really important, such as just mentioned, how do we know we know? All right, now, so we got to verse 71. Okay, I hope that's clear. And of course, you're welcome to ask questions about the river and so forth, the pus and blood. That is a complicated topic, and it'll come up again anyway. But now, as to verse 72, here Chandrakirti asks the Chittamatrans in that ongoing dialogue, well, whether there are really any Chittamatrans is not important, but it's still in the form of this debate or dialogue. So Chandrakirti asks, well, if you Chittamatrans, you talk about dependent natures, in other words, impermanent phenomena. Remember, I talked about how they divide up phenomena. Usually we talk about permanent phenomena, impermanent phenomena, right? Ordinarily, that's how all the Buddhist schools describe that which exists. But in the Chittamatra school, they take impermanent phenomena, that's one category, and then they subdivide permanent phenomena, and that which doesn't exist, whatever it doesn't exist, and permanent phenomena, and they divide them into imputed phenomena. That includes everything things that don't exist, plus all permanent phenomena other than emptiness. That's one category called imputed phenomena, and then there are thoroughly established phenomena, that is emptiness. So in other words, they say, okay, there's everything that's impermanent, there is emptiness, and there's everything else. And they include that which doesn't exist as well, because it's merely, even non-existent things are just labeled by the mind, but incorrectly labeled in this case. Okay. Now, without having to go into further explanation, if you understood as much as I said just now, fine. It's also not that important to understand it in all detail. But here we deal with impermanent phenomena, which the Chittamatra school calls dependent natures. So there it is. So Chandrakirti says, well, I'm mainly interested in your view on impermanent phenomena. So impermanent phenomena, there's the mind, of course, and there are the objects of the mind. Okay, both of those. Now, if this entity, he says, dependent nature, so anything that is impermanent, including object and subject, the mind itself, so they're free of duality and devoid of object and subject existing kind of as separate entities. Okay, now this is not what those words say, but free of duality and devoid of object and of subject really means there's not saying that there's no subject and object, but there's no separate subject and object. In other words, as we discussed before, there's no object out there and the mind just happens to perceive it, but rather due to the ripening of one imprint, there is a mind apprehending a car, and there's the appearance of the car. All right. And so they simultaneously ripen, they simultaneously appear or arise in dependence on the ripening of an imprint. So here, non-duality means that subject and object cannot be separated. They're inseparably linked. It's just an appearance to the mind. So it's like take the mirror and the reflection in the mirror. You can't kind of separate those two. You can't kind of put the mirror on one side and then the reflection in the mirror on the other side. So they're inseparably linked. Similarly, here the reflection in the mirror is like the appearing object, and the mind is like the mirror. Okay. Now, here we also don't talk about object and subject, mind and object, being cause and effect. And that is one criticism, for instance, of the Madhyamika school. They say, well, subject and objects must be cause and effect. And of course, more than that, there's more criticism of the Chittamatra school. So I may just mention that because I think it came up in your discussion group, Gila told me. Well, this whole idea, and here I'm just talking about it before I forget to mention it, but that in the Chittamatra school, they have a hard time. One of the criticisms of the Chittamatra school is setting forth cause and effect. For instance, a seed and a seedling. Like if the seedling appears to the mind due to this process I just explained, there's a ripening of an imprint, and then the eye consciousness perceives, or an eye consciousness perceiving a seed arises, and the appearance of the seed, they rise together. So an eye consciousness arises and the appearance of a seed, and so you have an eye consciousness apprehending a seed. But how do you, seedling, I should say, a seedling. But how do you, or sprout, a better word. So you have a sprout appears to the mind due to an imprint. But then the Chittamatra school would still say, well, every sprout has to be preceded by a seed. But how do you account for that? Sprout and seed giving rise to sprout. How do you account for that relationship of cause and effect if only the sprout appears, but to that person, there's only the unique appearance of that sprout due to that unique imprint, but there's no appearance of the sprout. So there's an appearance of the sprout, but there's no appearance of the seed. So how can you see the seed precedes the sprout. And so we debated that in the past. And I remember we came to some kind of conclusion. I don't remember exactly how. I don't think it was described in the text we studied. I don't think, no, it was maybe our teacher explained it to us, or we came to that kind of conclusion, but it makes perfect sense. So that in the Chitta Mantra school, well, what they would say is that if you have a sprout now, and that sprout uniquely appears due to the ripening of an imprint, how do you account for a seed to be there as well? And so the answer would be, well, when that sprout appears to your mind, it doesn't appear in a vacuum. You're in a place, right? Like if you visualize this sprout in front of you, well, it appears in a flower pot, for instance, and this flower pot sits on a table, and that table is in a room, and so forth. Now, of course, when we say the sprout appears due to the ripening of an imprint, that's a very simplified version of how the Chitta Mantra school would describe it. They would say imprints ripen for this whole scenery that appears to your mind. Okay, so not just the sprout, but the flower pot, the sounds around you, the light in the room itself with all its details, whatever is in the sphere of your vision, whatever appears to you. So that's all due to the ripening of imprints. And so if you were in that place long enough, you were there a little bit previously, I mean, you had that appearance also previously of that room that right now you're in, or that appears to your mind, together with the sprout. If you'd had that appearance early enough, there would have been the ripening of an imprint for a seed. Okay, so in the sense that every time you're long enough around, this is how the working of, well, the law of cause and effect works in the Chitta Mantra school. It's not random. It's not like in a dream anything can appear. And that's also how they account for the difference between the waking state and the dream state. In the dream state, you're flying around, you meet this person, and then that person becomes someone else. No, there's much more consistency when it comes to the wakened state. So according to the Chitta Mantra school, your imprints ripen with a certain order, and they ripen if you're in that place long enough. Let's put it that way. If there's a seed first, let's say you start with the seed, then if you remain in that room, that is, you have the wish to be there, and due to that wish, an imprint ripens, which allows you to continue to be in that room, then that will give rise to the ripening of the imprint of a sprout. Okay, so in that sense, they say, yeah, they're cause and effect. If you're long enough, if you're around long enough, the imprint will definitely ripen for you to have the appearance of a sprout and a seed. And you can observe this, that there will never ripen an imprint, I don't know, of a stone one moment, and the next moment in that same place, the ripening of the imprint of a sprout. That doesn't happen because you don't have sprouts arise from stones. So the imprints ripen with a certain order, with this kind of in a plausible way to account for laws of nature. So this is how the Chitta Mantra school would explain it. This was just something Gila and I discussed as part of the discussion group some of you are participating in. So I just wanted to clarify that. But going back to now, subject and object, having an awareness, an eye consciousness, perceiving an object, of course, they exist in a non-dual way. So as it says in verse 72, the Madhyamika school asks the Chitta Mantra, now if this entity, dependent nature, those impermanent things that you accept, in terms of them consisting of objects and minds, really, impermanent objects and mind, different types of awareness, they're impermanent anyway. So all dependent natures, you can, what do they include? Awareness, mind, and everything that's impermanent. Okay. And these things here, in particular, sense objects, these sense objects and the mind, they're inseparably linked. They're non-dual. So if they exist, by what means is that existence known? By what means is its existence known? Okay, because the Chitta Mantra school puts so much emphasis on the mind that it's very clear that for something to exist, there must be a mind. There must be a mind. The ripening of an imprint with regard to that mind gives then rise to the appearance of the object. So to say there's a table is not enough. In the Prasangika school, they would say, yeah, there's a table. There's a conventionally existent table that exists external to the mind. Okay, conventionally external to the mind, yes, but still it's conventionally existent, but still it exists external to the mind. In the Chitta Mantra school, no, there is a table, but there's a table because there's a mind that perceives it. So you need a mind that has an imprint based on it, or at least you have an imprint based on the foundational consciousness, so that a particular mind can have an appearance of that object. And we can say this object exists. Okay. Now, that is true for any sense object. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy to explain. But what about the mind itself? What about mind itself? What about the I consciousness? How do you account for the I consciousness to exist? Wouldn't you need another mind, again, to perceive the I consciousness, and therefore to say, yeah, the I consciousness exists because there's a mind that perceives it. It's due to the ripening of an imprint that there's a mind perceiving the I consciousness, and therefore we can say the I consciousness exists. So this is the Chitta Mantra school's view, which is why the Chitta Mantra school accepts a type of mind that's called self-knower. Self-knower. Now, if you study philosophy, you're familiar with this mind, self-knower. We study this a lot. And I said it's important to understand how we know. It's not important for the Chitta Mantra school in this context as much, but I'll explain to you how this is important and how, well, this is addressed as well. How do we know we know? But for the Chitta Mantra school, what is actually more relevant right now is the fact that they say all the sense objects, they exist because there's a mind to perceive them, and that mind that has arisen due to an imprint. So what about the mind itself? What about an eye consciousness? What about an ear consciousness? Well, they say an ear consciousness, an eye consciousness exists because with every mind, there's what's called a self-knower. Thupten Jinpa calls it a reflexive mind. I think that's his translation. Yeah, I'm going to use the word self-knower because I'm so familiar with it. That's really the Tibetan word. It's literally translated as self-knower. Reflexive mind seems to imply that you reflect on something. Seems to imply that, though that's not what he means here. So it's not about reflecting something. I mean, reflexive, not like as you reflecting on something, but rather on something, well, almost like being reflecting something else. I don't really know how he came to this term. So reflexive doesn't mean there is a mind that thinks about the I consciousness and that is the self-knower. No, it's quite different. It's this idea that every mind has two aspects to it, has two parts, let's say 2 parts to it. A part that looks at something other than itself and a part that looks at itself. Okay, so an I consciousness, the Chitta Mantra school would say, and also some other school, for instance, the Satantrika school or the Sutra school, they say, if you have an I consciousness, one part of that mind perceives visible objects, right? Shape and color. And another part of that mind perceives itself. In general, why is this asserted? So forget about this Chitta Mantra version of like, you need to have a mind independence, which then an imprint ripening with regard to that mind giving rise to its object. So therefore they say that an I consciousness exists. They account for the existence of an I consciousness because there's another mind perceiving it through the ripening of an imprint. So in other words, the I consciousness is also merely generated by an imprint which ripens from the imprints of the self-knower. Okay, right? So it just became a little bit more complicated. All right, let me just say that again. Just as the table only exists, so an external object such as a table, it only exists because it appears to a mind. Okay, it appears to a mind. And so leave aside non-existence that appears to the mind. That is a little bit more complicated for the Chittamatra school to explain. But just a table exists according to the Chittamatra school, not because it's out there, conventionally out there, no, because it appears to a mind. Why does it appear to a mind? Well, because there's an imprint ripening that gives rise to, let's say, an I consciousness to which that mind appears. Okay. Now, what about the I consciousness itself? It exists. The Chittamatra school would say yes. Well, it has to appear then. Yes. Well, why does it appear? Because there must be an imprint that ripens due to which that I consciousness appears to a mind. And the Chittamatra school says, yes, because it appears to the self-knower. It appears to this aspect of that I consciousness itself. It's just a part of that I consciousness that we don't call I consciousness, we call it self-knower. The I consciousness really is the part that looks at as a shape and color, and the self-knower is the part that looks at itself. So it's called self-knower. Okay, so this is how the Chittamatra school would describe it, but there's another reason for saying there's a self-knower. Other schools also assert this, and it makes sense. It makes sense. They say there's a self-knower. Why? Because we remember seeing something. How do I remember that I saw, for instance, a table yesterday? Can I remember I saw a table yesterday? The answer is yes, but only because I perceived the table yesterday, because I had an experience, a direct experience of the table. So therefore I can today remember, oh, I saw a table. If my eye consciousness hadn't seen the table, I could not remember the table today. I could not remember the table as an object. I couldn't remember there was a table in my room. Okay, so there's memory of a table due to the direct perception of a table at some point in time. Okay, but what about the fact that not only do I remember the table, I remember having seen a table? How's that possible? Do I not have to be aware of being aware of the table? Do I not have to be aware of being aware of the table? And many philosophical schools say, yes, you do. How are you aware? Because you have this self-knower. The Prasangika school denies that. Well, no surprise, why would it come up here? It's all about debating the Chittamatra, understanding, of course, in order to understand the Prasangika school better. So the Prasangika school says, there's no self-knower. It's just like this foundational consciousness that holds all the imprints. Don't need that. The imprints just exist fine. It's after the mind has ceased. That ceased state is impermanent, and that holds the potential for an imprint that's described as an imprint, and that gives rise to certain experiences. It works without this foundational consciousness. That is just, it's just a way for us to understand it better. But once you reach the Prasangika school, you don't need that crutch, if you like. You don't need that kind of idea that helps you to understand the idea of karma better. In the same way, how do we know we know? How do I know? How do I remember? Well, how do I know I know? That's the next part we need to address. But like just memory. How's memory possible? How is memory possible? So I remember yesterday I walked along this road and I met someone. Because there was an eye consciousness perceiving this other person, knowing the body of this person, realizing the body of this person, shape and color and so forth. And of course, there was this whole mental process, thinking while I'm with that person. The mind never stands still. I'm reflecting on the situation. But just this person now appearing to me again, suddenly I remember, oh, I saw this person. That's because I directly perceived their body yesterday. So this direct perception of their body triggers the memory today, or, well, not trigger the memory, but enables or makes it possible to have this memory of the person. But I also have the thought, I also remember, if you like, or there's also the thought, I saw that person. So how's that memory possible unless we also are aware of the seeing? You must be aware of the awareness of being aware of that person. And as I said, all the Buddhist schools, except, well, most of the Buddhist schools, no, not even most. I mean, the Sutra school and the Chittamatra school, and one of the Svatantrika schools, familiar with the schools, the Svatantrika, Yogacarya Svatantrika school. So those schools, they accept the self-knower, the rest doesn't. But it's really the Prasangika school that's most interesting in terms of their assertion that there is no self-knower. And that's what we're studying here. How do they account for memory? Here, Chandrakirti doesn't address that. He doesn't address it, but Lama Tsongkhapa does. The commentaries do. They address this. And it's important. It's actually taken from surprise, from Shantideva's Bodhisattva Way of Life, or Guide to a Bodhisattva Way of Life, the 9th chapter. It also talks about self-knowers. And since the 9th chapter is, well, the whole text from Shantideva is from the point of view of the Prasangika school, it supports the Prasangika. It describes the Prasangika view that there's no self-knower. And usually when we study about the self-knower, we leave aside Chandrakirti's text and take, when we debate it, we take Shantideva's explanation. But it's just a few words in the line, so we don't really take the text as such. We know the words that describe that fact, and that's it. But for that time, there's nothing more really in Chandrakirti's text. So we'll do the verses that relate to this. But what I'm going to say about the self-knower is not directly found in Chandrakirti's text. It's just an important topic. So just let me just read what Chandrakirti says before I go into the explanation that's given by Shantideva. All right. So as I just said, here in 72, it says, well, if mind and object, if they exist the way you say, cannot be separated. Well, how do you account for their existence? Okay, sense objects we know. How do you know? How does it happen with the mind? Without observing it, without the eye consciousness being observed by another mind, it cannot exist. So what is that mind that, because of the ripening of an imprint, has the appearance of an eye consciousness? And then it says in 73, okay, so the Chittamatra school would say cognition of itself, a self-knower. The Prasangika school says, no, that doesn't exist. Cognition that is aware of itself is not established. Okay, now, I said already that the Chittamatra school, and then the reason is given by the Madhyamika school why that doesn't make sense, but actually the Madhyamika school only gives the explanation from the ultimate point of view, saying, well, it has to be inherently existent according to you, and that doesn't make sense. So here the verses really talk about the ultimate, and then without implied in that is also the conventional explanation that we're more interested, well, that is harder to understand in that context, because we don't really know why the Prasangika says there's no self-knower and how they account for memory. Okay, now, okay, just need to check the time. All right. Now, let me say again, what does the Chittamatra say? They say a mind has two aspects, a self-perceiving aspect and an object-perceiving aspect, all right? As we had before. So the eye consciousness perceiving a table, there's an aspect, there's the self-knower aspect that perceives itself. So they use, of course, examples. What is the example they use? Okay, so this is how it's usually presented to us. They say like a flame, like a light that illuminates the surroundings and that illuminates itself. Okay, that's one of their arguments. They say the mind needs to know itself, or there needs to be an aspect of the mind. There needs to be the self-knower, which is inseparable from that I consciousness. In the case of an I consciousness, all the other consciousnesses. So just take the I consciousness as an example. It needs to perceive the object, shape and color, but it also needs to perceive itself just as a flame. A candle flame. It illuminates the surroundings and it illuminates itself. That's why you see the candle flame, because it illuminates itself. That's one example they give. Or another example they give is, for instance, when you say a word such as table. So at the same time, what you perceive is the word table, the sound, and you also perceive the referent object. Okay, so here the sound of the word, that's like the mind itself, the I consciousness itself, and the referent object is like the table. So they use these examples. Okay, we've already had using example, Chittamatra school using example one way, Prasangika school using an example in a different way previously. Now we deal with the self-knower. The Chittamatra school says, well, we know because just as light, just as a flame illuminates the surrounding and itself, or the example when you say a word, just as you hear the sound of the word, that appears to the mind, but also the referent object. Table is just the word, but then our sense, our concept of table, that also appear. So in the same way, you have the self-knower. Then the Prasangika school says, no. They argue using examples also. Okay. So they say, if you have a knife, that knife cannot cut itself. In the same way, you can't have an I consciousness. It's kind of like that has an aspect that looks at itself. Maybe another example, I haven't come across that example, but you can't have eyes that look at themselves. Okay. Your own eyes, they don't look at themselves. It's possible. I mean, you can look at the mirror, but then you see the reflection of your eyes. You don't see your actual eyes. So your eyes cannot see themselves, cannot look at themselves. Whereas the Chittamatra school says, well, yeah, and some other schools, the I consciousness, there's a part that looks at itself. The Prasangika school says, no, just as your eyes cannot see yourself, or the example they give, the blade of a knife cannot cut itself. The tip of your finger cannot touch itself. Your own finger, it can touch your other hand, or your other fingers, but it cannot touch itself. An acrobat cannot ride on his own shoulders. So as an acrobat, you can ride on another person's shoulders, but not on your own. And fire does not burn itself. Okay, so you see, these are the examples the Prasangika school says, and by way of these examples, they say the Chittamatra school, that doesn't make sense. Now, they also address the example of the flame that illuminates itself. So just for the sake of the debate that's usually described, the Chittamatra school insists, they use the example of the flame illuminates itself. And the Prasangika school says, no, but it doesn't illuminate itself. And they give kind of a nice, clever kind of reason. Whether you agree with it or not is to be seen. But what is mentioned in the scriptures is, what is the function of light? What is its function? What does it do? We say it illuminates things, right? It lights up things. It illuminates them, right? It makes things visible, in other words. That's the function of light. Okay. And what is the function of darkness? What does darkness do? I mean, darkness, of course, is merely labeled, but based on that label, we can say it has a function. It conceals things. It hides things, right? It makes them non-visible. That's why Lightness and darkness are opposites. Lightness makes things visible, while darkness conceals them, right? This is how we think of lightness and darkness. Okay, would you agree? I guess we could say we agree. I hope you do. I don't know. But the point is, so darkness has the function of concealing things, and light has the function of illuminating itself, illuminating things. This is how Chittamatra and Prasangika agree. But the Chittamatra school says, well, light illuminates itself. That's why the mind perceives itself. The Prasangika school says, no, the mind doesn't perceive itself, just as light doesn't illuminate itself. Light illuminates the surrounding. It does not illuminate itself. If it did, if hypothetically a candle flame were to illuminate itself, then it would follow that darkness would conceal itself, okay? Would make itself non-visible, because that's its function. If light illuminates itself, darkness would have to conceal itself. And that would mean we couldn't see darkness. We couldn't see darkness because it wouldn't be visible, because it would be hidden by itself. Okay? We say darkness conceals the table over there, so we can't see the table. But if darkness conceals itself, well, we wouldn't be able to perceive darkness, or we can perceive darkness. I see darkness, you know, when I switch off the light. Is it dark in my room? I can say yes. Can I see the table? No, it's concealed by the darkness. So this is the argument. Therefore, the Prasangika school says there is no self-knower. The mind does not know itself. One part of the mind, in other words, that looks at an external object, cannot know itself. Now, this gives rise to two questions. How can you be mindful of your own mind? And of course, how can you remember you saw? Okay, that needs to be explained. So I said there is a connection to today's topic in terms of mindfulness, or in terms of mindfulness of our own afflictive emotions, and in terms of how do we know we know. All right. Okay. So thus far, I hope it's clear what the Chittamatra school says. They very strongly believe, of course, you have memory, etc. Therefore, you must have an awareness of itself. The mind must be aware of itself. So have the self-knower aspect that's kind of part of it, inseparably linked to it. But also it accounts for the fact that the I consciousness itself exists. That's also existent in dependence on an imprint, the ripening of an imprint. So what happens when I have an I consciousness? There's an imprint giving rise to actually three things, okay? Because it became just a little bit more complicated. So previously, when we didn't mention the self-knower, we spoke about I consciousness perceiving table. So an imprint ripened, and a moment later, after the imprint has ripened, you have an I consciousness and the appearance of a table. Okay, therefore, you have an I consciousness perceiving a table. So the I consciousness just does what it does. It perceives things, but there needs to be something appearing first. Okay, the apprehension, the part of perception of being aware, that's just the functioning of the mind, of the I consciousness itself. But what you can only be aware of something if there's something appearing. Okay, something needs to appear to the mind. You can't be aware of something without something appearing. And so what accounts for the appearance? Not the external reality, as the Prasangika school says. No, the appearance is due to an imprint. But the imprint doesn't just give rise to the appearance of the table and the I consciousness. No, it also gives rise to a self-knower. It also gives rise to a self-knower, which then perceives the I consciousness. Okay, so the existence of the I consciousness is accounted for because the imprint gives rise to the I consciousness because there's this self-knower. Of course, you can have a bit of a problem. So what about the self-knower? What brought that into existence? Well, it itself. That's all they can self. Otherwise, you have an infinite regress, like a self-knower of a self-knower of a self-knower of a self-knower. And of course, that's ridiculous. Okay. All right. Anyway, just that's the kind of argument here, that for the I consciousness to exist and to also be appearing to a mind, because whatever exists appears to a mind, it needs a self-knower. It needs an imprint to ripen, And then due to that ripening of the imprint, the table appears to the I consciousness, and the I consciousness appears to the self-knower, and it all happens simultaneously. Okay? Does that make sense? Chittamatra school. Very important fact. That's why they need the self-knower. And the other schools who do not hold that there's no external, lack of external existence, well, they still accept that memory is possible only because there's an aspect of the mind knowing itself. And it kind of makes sense. This is how we learned it. We started off with self-knowers. We didn't know the Prasangika school didn't assert it. I certainly didn't know. Maybe some of my classmates did if they had already studied Madhyamika. I worked really hard on understanding that self-knower only to come to the Madhyamika class and it all be negated. But it was helpful. It was really helpful. It had that sense. It made sense to me how I know things. And I became more familiar with this idea of knowing the mind, knowing itself. And then later on, when that was taken away, it still made sense the way the Prasangika school explained it. But let me just quickly finish verse 73, because yeah, it's not that hard. I want to get to explain the Prasangika school, why they don't assert a self-knower. All right, so here, as we've had, self-knower, that's how the Chittamatra school account for the existence by means of what is existence known without observing it. You cannot say it exists, as it says in 72. Therefore, how do you account for an I consciousness? And of course, it's the cognition of itself, which the Prasangika school says, no, cognition that is aware of itself is not established. If you say, the Prasangika school says, this reflexive awareness is proven by later recollection, this is not so, because you're talking about inherently existent later recollection, okay? And there's no inherently existent. So here, Chandrakirti addresses only this idea of later on of remembering something. So the cause is the self-knower, or this reflexive awareness, the self-knower. That is the cause that gives rise to later memory. But those two are inherently different. And so Chandrakirti says, since everything is inherently existent, also those two are inherently existent. So that doesn't make sense. If you say this self-knower, this reflexive awareness is proven by later recollection, well, your later recollection is inherently existence, and that doesn't make sense, because the evidence you cite remains itself unproven. The evidence you recite is later remembering having seen something, but that's unproven because you're talking about an inherently existent memory, and that cannot be proven. We've already had all that discussion. So remains itself unproven, and what is not established cannot be a valid proof. You cannot establish an inherently existent later memory of something. So this is not a proof for a self-knower. Okay, that's 73. It just addresses like I said, only the ultimate aspect. Explicitly, only that is mentioned. Okay, and then it goes on to say in 74, even if a reflexive awareness were allowed, for the sake of argument. Okay, let's say there is a self-knower. Okay, let's just say there is a self-knower, but you still holding on to your point is inherently existent. That's the problem, first of all. So the self-knower is also denied, but for a different reason, and we'll come to that. But that's not explicitly mentioned. Here is saying even if there were a self-knower, okay, even there were a self-knower, but the problem is it would still be illogical for memory to recall prior cognition, the two being inherently different. Okay, it would be like the recollection of someone with no prior knowledge. So that would be like two different people, right? So the person who perceives the table with their I consciousness, if they're inherently different from the later person remembering seeing the table, well, that would be like Peter and Paul, Jill and John, or whatever, right? Those two perceiving, so let's say John perceiving something in the morning and Jill remembering in the afternoon. No, you don't remember what another person saw. You can only remember what your earlier continuum has perceived. But according to you, Chandrakirti argues, well, the two being inherently different, it would still be logical for memory to recall prior cognition, the two being inherently different. So being different here means inherently different. It would be like the recollection of someone, I don't know, called Peter, who is aware of something of someone with no prior knowledge. For instance, Paul, right? Having no prior knowledge. This reasoning destroys all other aspects. So this reasoning destroys all other aspects of that so-called proof, of that purported proof, or that so-called, that supposed proof that you gave of an inherently existent memory of something. Okay, so in other words, your idea of memory, it's all inherently existent. So that doesn't make sense. He's just really repeating the same argument as before and not really saying why in the Prasangika school there is no self-knower. But as I said, when we study this, you rely then on, for instance, Lama Tsongkhapa most extensively explains why there isn't, using Shantideva's text. And I'll do this now. All right. All right, so let's look at 75. Oh yeah, in 75, again, Chandrakirti doesn't really explain it, but he addresses it a little bit, and it's really in that context. So here the question that arises, how does if things don't exist inherently, how do you have memory of something? Well, apart from the recollection of the experience of the object, for us, there's no recollection that is extraneous, that is for something inherently different. There's no recollection of something that's inherently extraneous, that is inherently different. Therefore, the memory, I saw that can occur. It can only occur if things don't exist inherently. So there's a previous experience and later on as memory. This too is within the norms of worldly convention, just conventionally. Okay, but he still didn't say how it works, and I'll do this now. Like I said, it's not contained in the words. And the rest of it is there are a few more verses to come, and that's kind of the end, almost the end of the Prasangika, the Chittamatra school, and we'll start with something different soon. We still have to discuss why these verses, these verses we can go through quickly next time. And then there's also a little bit of discussion, why does it say in the sutra everything is only mind? What does that really mean, only mind? That will come to. But just for the self-knower now, how do we know if there's no self-knower? Okay, so what happens is this. One important idea in the Prasangika school is that every mind is aware. This is what the Prasangika school, that's something the not Chittamatra school, in the Prasangika school, they say there's no self-knower, but we still remember that we saw something. Okay, mindfulness is still possible. How do we remember we saw something? Well, because every mind, even if it's a wrong consciousness, every mind always knows something. Okay, that's very unique. The other schools wouldn't say that. If it's a wrong consciousness, they say it doesn't know anything. The Prasangika school says even the wrong consciousness, it knows something. So even ignorance, even the mind that holds onto inherent existence, it knows something. What does it know? It knows the appearance of inherent existence. Okay, the appearance of inherent existence. So every mind in the Prasangika school knows what appears to it. Okay, every mind knows what appears to it. Okay, that's very unique. So even if you have a wrong perception of something, and now we know, we know what appears. If I see, like, I don't know, a flying cow, well, to that eye consciousness perceiving the flying cow, it knows that the appearance of the flying cow, that appearance of the flying cow, it knows. Okay, and so later on, when let's say later on, I saw, I don't know, I saw a table this morning, for instance. Let's take something that exists. I saw a table this morning, So there was no self-knower in that moment. There was no other mind that was aware of it. It could be that a totally different mind arises, but that's a different idea. It's not that the I consciousness itself, there's the self-knower that's inseparable from the I consciousness itself. Here we're just focusing on the I consciousness, knowing that I saw this with an I consciousness. There's not that knower. So how do I know later on, not only that there was a table, but also that I saw the table? And how do I know? Well, because the appearance of the table, that the I consciousness itself knew the appearance of the table, and now it remembers the table. And so it knows, well, it knows the table appeared. It knows the table itself, that there was a table. So obviously, just by deduction, I know that I saw a table. Right? I don't need a whole different mind that gives me that information. I know anyway, because I know, I remember the table, and I remember the appearance of the table, because that's what the appearance of the table. So to what did it appear? To me, of course, to me. So therefore, I know later on that I saw. So I don't need that crutch. I don't need another whole other mind. My mind can do that without a self-knower, which is why the Prasangika schools doesn't say there is that mind. And you may all know this example. You may have heard of it. Shantideva explains exactly that by way of an example. It talks about a hibernating bear. You've all heard the story, I guess. A hibernating bear that's sleeping in a cave. It's asleep. Sleeping in a cave, and it's bitten by a shrew. The Thupten Jinpa calls it a shrew, S-H-R-E-W. It's some kind of long-nosed mouse. I don't even know it's a shrew, but whatever. It's this animal called a shrew. It gets bitten, and it's got poison. It's got poison. It's got like some kind of poison that enters the body of the bear, but the bear's asleep. So the bear's not aware of being bitten by the shrew. And then there's a thunder. There's thunder. And due to the thunder, the bear wakes up. There's a thunderstorm, and the bear wakes up and is now aware of the poison in the body. And through that, the bear knows it was bitten by a shrew. Okay, let's say it's an experienced bear, knows about shrews. Okay, so just as we are experienced, we've seen things since beginning this time. So here, the bear that's hibernating is like an I consciousness that doesn't have a self-knower that perceives a table. And then the memory, it's like the waking up of the bear. It's like the memory of that. So deducing that, okay, the bear knows, well, there's this experience of the poison that was probably, he's been bitten before, and therefore knowing, oh, I must have been bitten by a shrew. So likewise, when there's memory of a table, because the mind that perceived the table also knows the appearance of the table, and then therefore now, even though there was previously no self-knower, we know. Okay, that's Prasangika school. Now I'm so excited about this. I don't think you are. I learned about this in a lot of detail, but how do we know? We know. So is there a mind right away? No. So how does mindfulness happen? Well, that's much harder. The word for mindfulness is interestingly memory, recollection. So mindfulness, by implication, it's kind of like it implies it's kind of knowing something that possibly happened a moment earlier. And there's a lot of discussion on that. Like, okay, the I consciousness doesn't know itself, but can you have at the same time a mental consciousness observing the I consciousness? Or is it just a moment later? Is it just like a moment later, there's the I consciousness, and if you have self-awareness, if you really make an effort, mindfulness, self-awareness, of course you can know. It's not the self-knower, it's not part of the I consciousness, but it's a moment later that a mental consciousness arises that becomes aware, oh, a moment earlier there was the I consciousness, and that we call mindfulness. Or is it simultaneous? That's the question. Does it happen simultaneously? I consciousness, and at the same time the mental consciousness watches the I consciousness? Not the I consciousness watches itself, that would be a self-knower, no, but a mental consciousness observing the eye consciousness, or is it a moment later? And that's for an eye consciousness. How about a mental consciousness? How about a mental consciousness? You're angry now. If you're angry, can you in that moment have a mental consciousness, another mental consciousness that observes the anger? Well, we try that and the anger goes away. So does that mean it doesn't really happen simultaneously? Right? There's this whole kind of technique. If you get angry, observe your anger, and then the anger disappears. And then you go back to the object of anger and the anger is back, and then the mindfulness is. So it goes like, it's really hard to keep the anger while being aware of it. And so the question is, can you do both? Have anger, work actively there, be there, and at the same time have mindfulness of the anger? Or is it like there's anger and a moment later there's the self-awareness, and that's still okay? I mean, that's still all right. It still works, because our minds, they switch back and forth very quickly anyway. So it's like you're aware of what you're thinking, and then you go back to the thought, and you get aware of the thought, and you go back to the thought, and you're aware of the thought, mindfulness of the thought, and the thought, mindfulness. So it's this back and forth. Well, there's a lot of back and forth anyway. All right, that's it. That was a really quick version. So I'll say a little bit more about this. It's not in Chandrakirti's text, really. It's only implied, but we spend a lot of time learning about this. More details that are important to you right now, and I wanted to at least go through it. I say a few more words next time. And I guess we can just do a meditation on that. We can do a meditation on what I just said. How are we aware of something? So to just become more familiar with that. Sorry, I'm already 5 minutes late, but at least I get a sense I've finished something. So I finished this idea. And like I said, I'll address it briefly again next time, just to go over it quickly, and before we continue with the next verses and, well, moving towards the end of the Chittamatra school to start the next topic. Okay, great. The recording has stopped, I've just heard. Okay. Great. Now, as usual, let's do some meditation. Starting with a few moments of just letting go of any disruptive thoughts and focusing on the breath. Now, one important concept in Buddhism is mindfulness. And self-awareness. Now, is the mind aware of itself? According to the Prasangika school, it is not. There is no self-knower or reflexive awareness. Just as there's no blade, no knife that cuts itself, There's no fingertip that can touch itself, and no fire that illuminates itself. But then, how do we remember? Not just our breakfast from this morning, but also seeing our breakfast. Remember the breakfast, shape and color, and remember seeing the breakfast. Well, that is because the Prasangika school says that not only does the eye consciousness apprehending the breakfast realize the breakfast, but also it is aware of or realizes the appearance of the breakfast. In fact, every mind, even the wrong consciousness, is aware of what appears to it. So therefore, we know that since there's memory of the breakfast and memory of the appearance of the breakfast, we automatically know that we saw our breakfast. But then, if there is no self-knower, how does mindfulness of the mind, mindfulness of thoughts, how does that work? can I be aware of seeing my breakfast while I'm actually looking at my breakfast? The answer is yes. But it's not the reflexive awareness or the self-knower, which is part of the I consciousness itself. But it's a separate mind, a mental consciousness. That is aware of the I consciousness apprehending the breakfast. And although it's debatable whether while the I consciousness recognizes the breakfast, whether at the same time there is a mental consciousness recognizing the I consciousness. There's no fault if that mental consciousness apprehending the I consciousness arises a split second after the I consciousness apprehended the breakfast. The point is, we can be aware of our I consciousness apprehending something, and we can be aware of our mental consciousness arising as anger, attachment, self-cherishing, and so forth. For it is possible for a mental consciousness that is not the anger, not the self-cherishing or the attachment, to observe those afflictive minds. Or afflictive mental factors. And this is the mindfulness, this type of awareness called mindfulness is so crucial in our day-to-day practice. to not just pay attention to the world around us, the people around us, but to our own mind. In particular, to become aware of our own afflictive emotions, understanding their function, their arisal, and so forth. So now, whatever conclusion you've come to, having gone through this analysis of self-knowers or the absence of self-knowers, just use single-pointed meditation for a few moments to internalize your insight. To allow for it to sink deeper. And so now to dedicate whatever virtue we've accumulated here together, learning, studying some of the verses of Chandrakirti's text, may that become a cause for us to attain the fully enlightened state of a Buddha for the welfare of all sentient beings. But as always, let's also aspire that whatever virtue we accumulated, may it also make a difference in this world right now. Affect people around us in a positive way. May those who are sick, like Tali Lubin, get better soon. Those who are anxious and fearful, may it relieve their pain, their fear. And of course, the way Shantideva expresses it in his prayer, in his dedication prayer. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Okay, great. Okay, that's it for this week. And you know what to do for this coming week. Again, don't let go of bodhicitta. Whatever you do, try to be motivated by just that. And of course, also very important, use what you learned today to apply mindfulness. Be aware of your own afflictive emotions and learn how they arise. Try to recognize the exaggerating aspect. And even if you can't do that, while the anger is there, remember, the mind is just exaggerating these positive or negative aspects of the person, and try to bring it back into balance. Try to bring your mind back into this balanced state. Exaggeration, whether on the positive side or on the negative side. And that way, find a way to bring these afflictive emotions down. Okay, great. That's it. Have a great week. And please don't forget your questions. I will go back to my notes. They're a little bit all over. I received them via WhatsApp, via email. So I need to bring them together. And if I haven't answered your question yet, please send an email to the email address that was given to you. And also I go through whatever I have and try to address it again, but I'll do that next week. All right. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Geshe-ma. Thank you
very
much.
Good night. Welcome. Good night.
Good night.
Okay. Good night.
Thank you.
Laila Tov. Good night.
Thank you, Dharma friends.
Night, everyone.